Hey guys, thanks very much for joining me again. This particular video, I wanted to talk about a fandom that I've been involved with, like I said, ever since I was about 6 or 8 years old. Um, I'm 35, gonna be 36 in May. Yeah, I know I'm old. Um, Fandom keeps me young though. Like I said, I've been involved with Gem as a fandom ever since I was little. It was one of those shows that was part of my formative years, and I really have a lot of very fond, visceral, emotional memories and feelings about the series, all wrapped up in a little bundle. Um, it's a show that I started watching before it was even a show, because it originated as these little kind of the more you know commercials and bumpers and that kind of thing. Um, Telling kids about the dangers of smoking and going with strangers and that kind of stuff. But then they got bumped up to 15-minute episodes that were worked in between episodes of G.I. Joe and that kind of stuff. But then, amazingly enough, the show actually was promoted to a full series, and they it ran for 3 seasons when it was unfortunately canceled. Um, but so, the big news now is that some people are actually getting together to create a Gem live action film based on the original series. There are, however, some problems with this. A number of problems, actually. First of all, first and foremost being that they are not actually involving the creator of the series, Christy Marx. They're not actually involving her with the production in any capacity. As a matter of fact, when someone asked her about the plans for the movie, she said that she was surprised because no one had actually even told her about it or asked her how if she wanted to participate or wanted this to even happen at all. The next problem is that all of the high up production team, like the big important parts of the production team, the writer, director, producer, that kind of stuff, every last one of those higher ups is men. And one of them directed one of the G.I. Joe live action films. Another one was a producer for the Paranormal Activity series. And then the third one is Justin Bieber's manager. That's a problem. And, as a number of media outlets, including the Mary Sue, have pointed out, just as Christy Marx did herself, it's troublesome to see that this series that was so formative and important and fundamental for a lot of young girls growing up has been overtaken by a bunch of guys. Now, that's not to say that I think that they're bad at what they do. Far from it. I actually really liked the Paranormal Activity series. Didn't watch the G.I. Joe movie because meh. I hate Justin Bieber. I'm just going to get that out there. Sorry, I am not a believer in any way, shape, or form. That's not to say that these guys aren't really, really good at what they do. But at the same time, though, because this series, the original animated series, revolved so much around female characters and their feelings and their emotional relationships with so many different kinds of people, different types of relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, sisterhood, family, which was actually a pretty big message, pretty big important facet of the show in its original incarnation. All through viewed through the lens of women and, originated by a woman. I mean, yeah, I know that there are a lot of people that enjoy the show for the cheese factor, or they say, oh my God, that's so 80s, and all that kind of stuff, but I've always genuinely and sincerely loved this show. Not because, oh my God, it's such a throwback, or oh my God, it's so corny or cheesy. I don't think it's corny or cheesy. I think it's from the 1980s, and this is how things were back then. But I know for a fact that this particular show was what inspired what would come to be my lifelong love and appreciation for music and singing. Um, I wore my gem tapes out. For those of you guys who don't know, I'm just going to explain a little bit more about the show, just so you don't have to hop on Wikipedia and look at it. But basically, Hasbro had created a line of dolls, and they went to an animation studio and said, okay, we would like you to create an animated series based on these dolls. I think they came up with the idea that, I don't know my canon too well on the early days, but so pardon me on this, but they said, okay, they're rock stars, and so we would like you to figure out a storyline for these characters, and just see where it goes. Because Hasbro had already had really, really great success with G.I. Joe as a series. And so they were trying to kind of play around and see if they could do something similar for the girls. But so, the series was released when when it actually was promoted to a proper 30-minute program. Aired every Saturday along with a lot of the other, standard cartoons, G.I. Joe, Thundercats, Justice League, that kind of stuff. Like I said, I can't remember what exactly aired at the same time. All I know is that, Transformers, stuff like that, just typical Saturday morning cartoon fare. But so, they started the series out and, started airing full length episodes. It was, reasonably very popular amongst little girls. They actually really enjoyed it, even though it did deal with surprisingly very mature themes. Every single episode had at least 2 songs in it, because this series revolves around a character named Jerrica Benson and her sister Kimber. It turns out that Jerrica and Kimber's dad was an inventor, and he invented this computer, this holographic generating, this holograph generating computer named Synergy, among other things. But so, in typical cartoon fashion, Mr. Benton has created these things so that his daughters can create a band, form a band of some sort, and, manage to make some money to support the Starlight Foundation, which is a foster home for a lot of, orphaned, neglected, unwanted children. It was Jerrica and Kimber's mom had started Starlight House, and so there were a lot of children already there when when the story picks up. But so it's Jerrica and Kimber, and then there's their friend Aja, and then also Shayna, who both of them were, Starlight kids. And so, it's primarily it revolves around Jerrica. There's a pair of earrings that she can wear that help her, with the help of Synergy, transform into this rock star named Gem. And, she's got a fantastic voice. All of her friends are, for some reason they're really, really good musicians before they even get started on before they kind of get the idea that this is what they want to do. But so, like, the whole point of, the pilot episode is to establish the fact that, Synergy is a thing, that there's a transformation that's possible. and it also establishes the fact that kind of Starlight House, this is an ongoing plot thread, is that, Starlight House is in jeopardy, because Eric Raymond, who is, a manager for this group called the Misfits, he wants to get his hands on Starlight Music, which is Jerica and Kimber's music company, that was willed to them by their father after he died. But so, he really, really wants to get his hands on this studio so that he can use it to promote the Misfits and, make them a big success, blah, blah, blah. But so, Eric is really underhanded, and he uses a lot of dirty tricks to try to, sway things in the Misfits' favor. It basically culminates in this showdown, in this park. And, it looks as though, like Eric has brought on these other bands that are nowhere near as good as the Misfits. And Jem and the Holograms are not participating at this point because, they haven't been allowed to audition or perform. It's been a while since I've seen it, but rough estimate of what that's like. But so basically what it is that Eric is seconds away from saying that the Misfits have won the competition, which has basically been rigged in their favor to start with, when all of a sudden this music bursts out and everybody turns to look, and Jem and the Holograms are on another stage that they've set up themselves, and they're singing and, kind of introducing themselves to the world. But so, it turns out that they win the competition, they get to hang on to their father's, music company, and, so they take it over, and, they use that as the means of, funding and supporting the Starlight Foundation, or Starlight House, I should say. But so that's the basic gist of the pilot, and with it being a series, like I said, there were 3 seasons. Almost all of the characters, most of the central characters are female. The band members that I named, plus the Misfits, there's 3 of them. There's Pizzazz, Stormer, and Roxy. Pizzazz is a spoiled rich girl, and, Stormer is the sweet one, and then Roxy is kind of the dumbass, but she's a tough girl too. I shouldn't say dumbass, that's mean, because she's actually not so bad, but so it's constantly, like I said, a common theme that you'll find in the series is the Misfits and the Holograms butting heads over various things. Usually control over Starlight Music, usually competition of another sort. Like I said, the show is surprisingly mature, considering the fact that it's about what it's about. It's about a rock band, actually a couple of rock bands, that are constantly clashing and performing, and, lots of drama and intrigue, and actually a lot of romantic drama too. Because, Jerica does have a boyfriend whose name is Rio. He does not dance on the sand, but but so he starts out as Jerica's boyfriend, and eventually becomes their Jem and the Holograms road manager. But so he's involved with setting up equipment and getting roadies sorted out and that kind of thing. Sorry, I have an itch. But so that's another little ongoing plot arc for the series, is the fact that once Jerica starts transforming into Jem, she becomes, she and the group become really, really popular, and so she's very much living a double life, and weirdly, Rio is also attracted to Jem at the same time, probably because of a lot of the stuff that he sees in Jerica that also manages to shine through in Jem. But it's a really complicated kind of a romantic situation. And again, this is really mature content for kids that are like 6 or 8 years old, which is, generally the audience that was intended to buy these dolls and stuff. Um, but I mean, there's like jealousy that's dealt with, um, quasi cheating, kind of actually in a lot of ways. Like I said, a continuing perpetual arc is the fact that Rio hates being lied to and has actually some pretty serious anger control, anger management problems when it comes to lying. And so, you know, things have kind of gotten away from Jerica, and she hasn't been able to find a way to tell Rio who she really is, when as Jem. She hasn't been able to break the news to him, and so, she's genuinely afraid that if she does, he'll break up with her, and that'll be it. Um, but so, like I said, the show ran for 3 seasons. A lot of other side characters pop in and out. They made dolls of almost everybody on the show, weirdly enough. There was another band that came in season 3, which are actually, apart from the holograms, are my favorite characters, which is the Stingers. Who, the band is comprised of, it's another band, and they're comprised of Riot, who's the lead singer, Minx, who is the keyboardist, and then Rapture, who is the guitarist. But so their storyline is actually very interesting. It's kind of it's really fascinating because their success is very hard won. They actually have to work to get to where they are. They're very influential. They're very their style is very new amongst the bands on the show. They're very arrogant, they're very egotistical, they're very obnoxious, but at the same time they've earned it because they started literally from nothing, and they were on the streets, and they just started playing together, and it's something that they were really good at and something they loved. So they work so hard to get where they are, and I guess they figure that they've kind of earned the right to be assholes. But so we get to see, we get to meet a lot of the Starlight House girls, a lot of the foster and adopted kids that Jerica and Kimber, and the rest of the band, constantly work so hard to support. A lot of them are great. Some of them are super annoying, though. It depends on, I guess, your favorite flavor of orphan. But so, so that's kind of the series in a nutshell. I strongly, really, really strongly advise people watch it. Like I said, I don't love this show because it's, the ironic, hipsterish thing to do. I love it because it taught me to love music. And it taught me, how amazing and transformative and moving music can be. Because my father was actually a musician, and he tried to teach me how to play. But I never felt the kind of excitement and happiness and joy trying to learn how to play guitar with him as I did listening to Jem and the Holograms and the Misfits and the Stingers performing their music. That's what got me into music, is watching that show as a kid. But so, like I said, I do think that there are some problems with the fact that there are these 3 men that are, trying to, do this live action take on the movie or the series, not for the least of which because they're changing, they're making some really drastic changes to the storyline that I really don't care for. Like, for example, the fact that instead of these characters, like Jem or Jerica and Kimber and all of the rest of them, rather than being grown adults, a lot of them, like Jim, I keep saying that, Jerica and Kimber and everybody else are teenagers instead. And it's some kind of treasure hunt or scavenger hunt or something in order to locate Mr. Benton's synergy, the equipment that he built specifically for his daughters. But so, just something about that really concerns me. And again, the fact that it's three guys that are, handling, heading up this movie, it does bother me quite a bit. Because, more recently, there was just a little while ago, I think it was, I can't remember if it was IO9 or Kotaku or someplace like that, but somebody wrote an article about, it was a guy, wrote an article about Saturday morning cartoons and specifically stated that there were no decent cartoons for girls in the 80s. I made a point in the comments section to say, excuse me, but there was actually Gem and it was amazing. But of course the author just hand waved it off and said, it still sucks. There's nothing, I'm not going to listen to anything you say about this. But it's like I told him, I said for me, the series, again, it inspired this lifetime appreciation for music. It taught me to be a good sport, even if nobody else is being a good sport. Trying to be a good person. Deep down, that's the most important thing, is to be a good person. Try to help people out. Try to do the right thing. Look out for people that you care about. And, that's the core messages for me. Family, close friendships, art, creating things that are meaningful. That's the stuff that this show is about, and it's important. Like I said, a lot of people would just dismiss it as just this crappy 80s, cartoon that's just about, romantic drama. But it's a lot more than that, because it shows, like I said, it deals with some really complex issues, especially considering the target age range for this series. It deals with stuff like drugs. It deals with stuff like identity. That was a very common and recurring theme in the show, is identity, and what makes you who you are, and can you be two people at once? Can you be happy if you're not being true to yourself, in whatever sense that might be? Because that's something that comes up a lot on the show and in the music too, particularly. Jerica realizes that Rio is attracted to Jem very strongly, but she has no idea what to do about it. And so in several songs, you'll hear Jem singing about, from Jerica's perspective, well, who is he kissing? What do you do with that? It's like, what do you, is it because he cares about me and all those facets of myself that kind of shine through her? Or is it just her? Or is it me? Or, it's a very almost existential kind of look at things. It's literally questioning identity. That's one of the key themes in the show. It's actually really, it's actually pretty intense. But it's really interesting. Especially in later seasons. We learn a lot about, like I mentioned, about the Stingers in particular. We see them as homeless people on the street. They don't shy away from this stuff. They don't they don't cookie cut it. They don't make it, they don't sugarcoat it. They don't make it seem harmless. They are actually very, very specific and very insistent on talking about stuff that's dangerous, including running away, drugs, mischief, getting, doing stuff that you really shouldn't be doing, just that kind of thing. But so they really didn't shy away from that stuff, and again, that was, I think, one of the things that made the show so awesome and so fascinating, because, contrary to what that dickweed reviewer said, I personally think that this show was one of the best cartoons on TV in the 80s, because it did deal with such complicated issues. Like I said, a lot of people would, just view this as kind of like a rock and roll soap opera. And in some senses it can be, because it does deal with a lot of, jealousy and intrigue and that kind of stuff. But like I said, it does bring up some pretty heavy issues considering the audience that it's playing to. But so that's a lot of what my concerns are, is that I don't think that the producers of this live action movie are really considering this. And, I think that they're just wanting to make a fun movie that they can cash in on and get some more money from Hasbro. So Hasbro can make another, couple million or billion or whatever. But, that's the thing, is that, oh, I forgot to mention, like with the show, they did release a series of dolls, and every single doll came with a cassette tape. And so there was usually one song on each side. And, like I said, everybody got one of those. All the dolls got a audio tape. I always wore those out when I was a kid. I wore those out when I was little, just listening to them over and over and over again. But so I like I said, I really do have a lot of concerns about this. And I mean, the producers to their credit, they are actually, kind of opening the doors and hopefully, lending their ears to the fandom. And they're, wanting us to tell them what we think and what we want to see in the movie. And so that's what I want to see. I want to see the show recreated as faithfully as possible, because it is possible to transfer, kind of parlay a lot of the original content up, not necessarily update it, but just bring it forward again. Just kind of carry it over into the series. Because again, I think that, I do realize that, the original intention of the series was to sell toys. But at the same time, for me, and I think a lot of other fans, longtime fans, a lot of us, it means a lot more to us than that. And it's not just nostalgia. It's, taking away some really strong messages. Being true to yourself, being a good sport, being able to express yourself and let people in, identity and trying to figure out who you are, and just all of these things, it's like how you relate to family, how you relate to friends and boyfriends and girlfriends, and, all these different kinds of relationships. And no, it's not G.I. Joe. And so I think that's why I'm concerned, is because I don't want them to come at this from that perspective of, okay, so it's a toy, so we're going to make a toy movie. We're going to make a movie that'll help them sell even more toys. I want them to respect the material. Moreover, I want them to respect the creators, the originators of the show. I want them to bring Christy Marx in, if not to be a writer, then maybe a consultant. Because personally, it makes me actually really uncomfortable, the thought that 3 guys are going to be responsible for telling the story about a band of women, and, young women, you know, in addition. It does bother me that the characters are, the presumably are going to be aged down. I don't want this to be fucking Hannah Montana. They've already got one of those. They've already had one of those. We don't need another Hannah Montana. Jem came before Hannah Montana. Okay? So we don't really need another one of those scenarios where it's a bunch of little kids, you know, finding out about this cool technology and, ooh, we can do this. I don't want that. I don't want to see a movie about a bunch of little children because that's not what the show was. It was about adults living adult lives with adult problems, pretty hardcore adult problems in a lot of cases. Don't just boil it down to, oh, it's a retro show from the 80s that was about a band. It's not that simple. And it's not even as simple as, oh, well, it's an 80s show from, you know, cartoon show from the 80s about boys kissing girls. And it's like, no, that's not it either. There's more to this show than what nostalgia would have you believe. Like I said, it really bugs me that they're looking at this, they're taking this on as men, but this is not a man's narrative. This is not a man's story. This is actually the story of a pretty considerably large group of women. And again, I stress, I want this to be about women, not girls. I don't want this to be a teenagers that are doing this. Because again, we've already got Miley Cyrus. We've got Hannah Montana. We don't need another, stupid trend that's going to die off in 2 years. If that. Make it about universal themes. Make it about stuff that matters. Make it about being charitable, being, conscious of the world around you. Because that's the thing, is that they actually dealt with that kind of stuff. Again, they dealt with that stuff on the show. Talking about poverty, about famine, and famine relief and helping other people in the world, So it's not as though this is just some light little airy, meaningless, pointless series. It actually had some real depth to it. And it's a lot more than girl finds earrings that are holographic, have holographic capabilities so she can transform into somebody else. It's not that simple. And the sense that I get from these guys is that that's what they want to do. They want to boil it down to the bare essentials and just strip out any of the depth and meaning. And that's concerning. That's really concerning. As a huge, long-time fan of the show, that bothers me. Because it does matter. The messages that the show carried, like I said, for me, it was stuff that I've carried with me to this day. And I imagine that a lot of the hardcore fans feel exactly the same way. So for me, like I said, I don't want this to be about a bunch of teenage girls. I want it to be about grown-ass women who are living their lives and having this stuff happen. Because like somebody pointed out, it's like what point, like the whole point of the original series was that Jerrica and Kimber and all of the rest of them were adults and they had to look out for these orphans. They had to look out for these foster kids because nobody else was going to do it. That was their responsibility. It doesn't make sense to make Jerrica and Kimber and all the others teenagers, because why are they actually going through all the trouble of finding synergy? It doesn't really make sense. The motivation doesn't make any sense if that makes sense to you. Because again, it's stripping the meaning from the whole thing. Because that for me was a lot of what Jerrica and Kimber's characters were about, what the entire band's characters were about, is looking out for other people, taking care of people, and actually being, it also pushes multiculturalism because Aja is Asian, Shayna is black, Jerica and Kimber are white, and then they add a Latina member, I think in season 2. So, they deal with a lot of stuff. It's a very diverse cast of characters. Some people like to think that some of the characters were even gay or lesbian. Of course, they wouldn't mention that kind of stuff explicitly, although with some of the stuff they dealt with on the series, it's a wonder that they didn't. It's really a wonder that they didn't deal with that kind of stuff. Because some of those characters were actually pretty gay. But so yeah, I want this to be a story about women that are going through this, And I mean, yeah, it's gonna be a fantasy. It's gonna be something where you have to suspend your disbelief. But that's kind of the whole point, and that's another reason why I think making it live action is a dodgy proposition anyway. Is it's gonna be very difficult to do the effects and make them look good. With animation, you have a lot more freedom to do things, and so as much as I admire their ambition to make this a live action thing, I don't think they would be able to pull it off with any degree of success. So yeah, I want them to get Christy Marx involved. I very much want them to try to maintain as much of the original storyline and character profiles as possible. I want them to bring a female perspective into this movie, because there was stuff like Strawberry Shortcake and Rainbow Bright and stuff like that, but those were aimed, My Little Pony, like the original one, and that kind of stuff that dealt, that was intended for girls. But this was a show that was for girls, and it didn't talk down to them. It didn't treat them like babies. And that's a concern that I have, is that they're going to dumb the show, they're going to dumb this movie down and just boil it down to like the most cliche garbage that you can possibly imagine, just to make just to make a quick buck. That concerns me. That concerns me a lot, actually. Because this is a smart show. It is corny. Yeah, it is cheesy. Yeah, it's from the 80s, but it had a good message. It had a lot of good messages, actually. And so to ignore those for the sake of the novelty of the holograms and that kind of stuff, when there's no guarantee that they'll be able to pull it off well anyway in live action, that, again, it's troublesome for me as a fan. But so that's what I would say. That's what I would tell these guys. Bring in a woman, bring in Christy Marx. Let her write the story for you. Let her tell you how it should be, because I think it is entirely possible to update the series and even make a movie. But you have to have some female input on this. This whole thing reminds me entirely too much of Daryl Ice's, religious freedom meeting that he had, talking about, where he gets a bunch of religious men from various sects of religion together in order to talk about reproductive rights for women. Not a single female on the panel. They didn't, any time that they talked to a woman, if they even let her speak, they would shut them up and dismiss them. And honestly, that's what it feels like is happening here. They have taken something that was so very much a female thing. It revolved around female characters, and the series was, it was this outlook for women, and it was something that just didn't happen. It was something that didn't exist before before the show actually happened. It was a viewpoint and a, it's hard to put it into words, but it was a it was serving an audience that was underrepresented very, very horribly by, um, you know, cartoon creators, toy creators, all that kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where I stand on the whole thing. Um, some people are trying to remain optimistic and say, well, it might still be good. And, but a lot of people, from what I've seen, a lot of hardcore longtime fans are saying this is gonna suck. you know. Um, but so I hope this has been interesting. This has just been me rambling for almost an hour at you, and I'm really sorry it was so long, but I wanted to talk about this show because, like I said, it was my very first fandom, and it was and still is a show that I love very much, very sincerely. No trace of irony or hipsterism involved with this one. This is something that was very, very important and very key in my upbringing, and development as a human being, I think. Um, so to see three guys try to take it over and do their rendition of, what an all-girl rock band should be like, it's worrying, suffice it to say. Um, but so thank you very much for watching. If you guys have any comments, opinions, thoughts, by all means, leave them down below. Um, what would you like to see in a gem movie? Would you like to have it be live action, or would you prefer it to be animated? Even maybe CG. Uh, how do you feel about creator Christy Marx not being informed or even aware of the existence of this movie getting off the ground? What would you tell the producers of this movie that you want to see in it? Some things to think about. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.